All right, a little bit about ASD. Our mission is to build a thriving regional food and ag system that creates healthy communities, respects the planet, and cultivates profitable opportunities for Appalachians. Who we are, we have been around since 95, so we're about to turn 30, which is pretty exciting. Our work falls into 5 key areas. We've got workforce development, agriculture education, food access, economic development, and resource conservation. And resource conservation is where agroforestry falls within our programming. And we work mostly in Central Appalachia, but we also have some programming that sort of expands beyond that. And this picture in particular shows the areas that are food hub services between farmers and recipients. So we really believe that ag has the power to transform Central Appalachia, helping with food access, employment, and poverty issues. In our region, 1 in 8 families are food insecure, and the number of farms and farm acreages are in decline. And nationally, we have some of the highest rates of average poverty, hunger, and employment. And here's kind of how we're leading the way at the moment. To date, we've sold $40 million in produce and distributed for regional farmers. 150,000 plus pounds of food grown by new gardeners. We've installed 80 or more raised beds to be managed at schools and clubs. Helped preserve 5,000 or more acres of forest land. Over 300 new farm startups are supported by the training and resources that we provide. And over 7 million pounds of local and regional food has been donated to area food pantries. So we're pretty proud of the work we're doing. And one of the things that we're extra excited about right now is that we are building a destination agricultural campus to support regional ag. So we're doing all kinds of demonstration work there. And we are in the middle of a big capital campaign, and it happens to be Giving Tuesday season. So if anyone is really excited about the work ASD is doing, we would love to see you chip in. We've got a 1-to-1 match going right now up to $40,000. So that's pretty exciting. And if you are someone with like just spare millions of dollars lying around and you're interested in naming opportunities on like greenhouses and stuff like that, we've also got those kinds of opportunities. A little bit about our agroforestry program. You can find us on the website by going to the programs tab and dropping down into agroforestry. It looks slightly different than this now, but you can still find it that same way. And a lot of the work we're doing right now is working with specific grant programs to get farmers and landowners funding to work with agroforestry in their own spaces. The 3 main ones right now are the Expanding Agroforestry Project that's led by the Nature Conservancy. And we've got the Catalyzing Agroforestry Grant Program we're working with, led by Virginia Tech, and the Assets Grant Program, also led by Virginia Tech with Working Trees, and that one's tied to carbon credits. We also, one of the big programmatic pieces that we're really into and excited about and really working to advance, and Sesha Warren is really kind of at the helm of this right now, is the Agroforestry Trainings for Natural Resource Professionals. And this is all about training the folks who sort of hold the keys to the kingdom for funding and like especially public funding. So working with like NRCS, DOF, Extension, all these folks to increase the knowledge capacity so that we can actually get the funding out there onto the land and into agroforestry practices. Alongside that, so that really entails like in-person training, and then we also have an online course that I think is going to get touched in on a little bit later today too. But there's 2 free components in the online course that you can find at learnagroforestry.com. And those are the Intro to Agroforestry and the Social Competencies piece. So those 2 modules are totally free, and the others are pay to play, but it's extremely reasonable. Lastly, the Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub is a big piece of our agroforestry programming, and this is a shared use processing and marketing hub that's located in southwestern Virginia, and we do trainings, cost share. We have shared processing equipment like spray tables and dryers and mills that help like break up herbs so that farmers can get their whole products out of the ground and processed into what a company, maybe like a food company or a tea company, might want to actually be buying. And then we also do aggregation practices. So like we help, say 10 farmers are growing 1 pound of ginseng, and we can help put that together into 1 order of 10 pounds of ginseng so that they can access buyers that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access. So that's a really cool piece of what we're up to. Just a quick reminder, we've got another session next Tuesday featuring Zach Elfers. We're going to be talking about honey locusts, and I'm really excited about this one. He's in particular, we hear a lot about honey locust in silvopasture. He's really interested in honey locust as a potential food product to scale up as a like a sugar source, carb source. So I'm excited to hear more about that. All right, and I'm ready to be done speaking. This is where we're headed. We're going to launch a poll really quick. Stasha, I think, has access to it this time, so can pop that up. It's just asking about where you're located, what you, or actually, I don't think it's where, but what you're up to and what kind of things you may or may not grow. And I will, while people are filling out that poll, I will stop sharing my screen so that Ruth and Rafter can get their information pulled up. Ooh, you know what? I'm not going to do that because I want to read bios first. So while you're doing the poll, I'm going to read bios. So I know that it's annoying to just hear someone read off of a screen, but I really want to do it anyway because I want y'all to hear how awesome these people are. So Ruth Tyson, a plant lover and naturalist, has invested in understanding her curiosity and passion for sustainable food as a bridge between the natural and social worlds. After studying sociology and environmental studies at St. Mary's College of Maryland, she committed to building a sovereign, sustainable, transparent, and just local food economy for Black and Brown communities, like the food apartheid that impacted her childhood neighborhood. She believes in the power of research, storytelling, art, personal transformation, and organizing as necessary healing modalities for individuals, communities, and ecosystems. Ruth brings a Black queer ecofeminist framework to the gardening and farming, education, advocacy, nutrition, food service, retail, and foraging worlds of the DMV and nationally. Ruth is creating digital content, hosting plant walks, and consulting for local and regional food and farm organizations to pollinate transformative ideas and relationships to heal land and people. And I'm just so happy to have Ruth on today. She and I actually met both of you in Seattle last year. And it's been really fun just to like stay in touch with you, Ruth, and hear about what you're up to. And we're Duolingo buddies, so we try to help each other accountable on our Spanish learning. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce Rafter. Rafter Ferguson is a researcher and educator focusing on diversified farms, grassroots farmer networks, and justice and equity issues in agriculture. After receiving his PhD from the University of Illinois and postdoctoral work at the University of Lisbon and Haverford College, he spent 3 years in the Food and Environment program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. There, he worked on projects addressing racial equity in agriculture, helped steward relationships with the grassroots partners and tribal organizations, authored blogs including Why Can't We Separate Justice and Sustainability in the Food System, and led reports on the impacts of farmland consolidation on Black farmers and new farmers, and on the impacts of climate change on farm workers. So y'all are both just doing such good and important work, and I'm so happy to hear more from you. And also, I'm happy to see you again, Rafter. We also met in Seattle after a 20-year estrangement. We realized we had met 20 years ago at in a very niche situation when I was in massage school as in my, I think I was 20 at the time in massage school, and he was visiting a friend of his there. And here we are. The rest is history. So thanks y'all for being on. Now I am going to go ahead and stop sharing. And just looking at the poll, Stesh, did you make that visible? Here we go. Share results. Are y'all able to see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, so let's see. A lot of natural resources professionals in the house, just some interested folks and students, some other. If you entered other, please feel free to throw in the chat what it is that you are up to. I know we need to include researcher on that because someone noted that last time and I forgot to do it before we started today. So then we have folks that are some not growing, about a quarter, but then a lot of annual production. Oh, more, as much perennial as annual, and more tree crops than annual. So I like that. I like to see that. And a lot of non-timber forest products too. Cool. All right, I love these little glimpses into the audience. All right, I officially am going to stop talking though. Take it away, folks.
Let's see. Thank you so much, Emily and Stacia and everybody at ASD. It's always a pleasure working with y'all. And I just wanted to, like, let's see, add on to the bio for Ruth and I is that I was lucky enough to work with Ruth at Union of Concerned Scientists back in DC. I'm in Western Massachusetts now, and uh, it's been it's been such a gift um, to get to reunite and work with Ruth over the past few years on this project for Interlace Commons and also in collaboration with ASD. Ruth, is there anything you want to add to introducing us?
I thought that was a great introduction. I'm excited to be here and be in conversation with you all.
And thank you for being here and collaborating with us. It's awesome to have the opportunity. We're really grateful.
Yeah.
Um, well, that makes all of us then, I guess. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here always happy to be in a space full of people who are thinking hard about agroforestry and about doing the practical work of figuring out how to support farmers through this complex process of planning, implementing, financing, practicing agroforestry. And for the work that Ruth and I do, part of our sort of foundational kind of belief about that is that in order to grow and succeed, agroforestry as a space and as a practice needs to have a deep community with a diversity of perspectives that will allow agroforestry as a whole to avoid detours and false steps. And agroforestry also needs a broad coalition um, that can advocate for the strategies and the practices, both like, in terms of funding and administrative and on the ground, that will actually make the most difference. And it also needs accessible pathways to participation that can welcome all farmers. Um, this is the climate crisis is really an all hands on deck kind of situation, and any farmers that want to contribute to mitigation and adaptation by adopting agroforestry need to have pathways by which they can do that. We need everybody on board. Um, and well, let's say I'll go back one. I'll just say why in particular agroforestry needs this. And the context is that, and this is I'm sure not news to anybody, but the agricultural system in the U.S. is extremely concentrated. Power, resources, land, influence are distributed in an extremely lopsided way across the agricultural space, and just through like every aspect and subsector of agriculture is lopsided and concentrated in this way. And the potential outcome of that is that big decisions that are made about how to implement and grow agroforestry could be tilted to benefit the folks who are already benefiting from the current system, right? And it's in the face of that danger of creating an agroforestry that really just benefits the folks who are already benefiting from the current system, which is why we need a deep and broad and accessible agroforestry community. And so what's in the way of that is, in particular, this long record of systematic discrimination against Black, Indigenous, and other people of color farmers, including long and well-documented histories of denial of credit, land loss, exclusion from technical support, exclusion from other programs, as well as ample evidence that those same processes are at work today in old and new ways. And the consequences, right, of not intervening, not being really thoughtful and caring and strategic in how we practice and grow agroforestry is that the status quo will continue, which is that support will overwhelmingly go to white farmers, and that our agroforestry community will not be deep, broad, and accessible, and will not have the depth and diversity that it needs in order to succeed. So you can find a capsule history of discrimination in US agriculture in Up from the Roots, a report that we'll talk more about in just a little bit, and along with lots of links and references to further research. So if I could only show you one slide today, if we could only show you one slide, this would be it. And that is to identify, all the barriers that we know well that all farmers face to agroforestry adoption, which is, the scarcity and cost of farmland, the general sort of farmland access crisis, the way that our credit system is set up to support annual crops and quick return annual crops over any sort of regenerative or long-term practice, the shortage of knowledgeable technical support, that a lot of forms of credit and support are geared towards larger and specialized farms, and that there's a lack of access to information in forms that are actually useful to farmers. And we combine that with the legacies of discrimination that BIPOC farmers are facing in general, which is a heightened state of farmland access crisis due to the history of land loss and land theft, and the heightened degree of difficulty in accessing credit and accessing land, systematic discrimination that still takes place through a lot of agencies, offices, and programs, generally having smaller and undercapitalized farms, which means a narrower margin, so higher risk in implementing new strategies, more difficulty implementing strategies with long-term payoff or practices with a long-term payoff, and a more difficult time accessing credit, as well as the interpersonal and cultural legacy of these histories of discrimination, which is an alienation and lack of trust with USDA offices and employees. So BIPOC farmers who are attempting to implement agroforestry, who are interested in agroforestry, are having all the regular agroforestry challenges compounded by these legacies of discrimination. And so the barriers and the hurdles are higher and more pernicious and require a lot more thought and care in order to begin to remedy. So this slide is also taken from our report, Up from the Roots, and I'll pass it over to Ruth to talk about that report a little bit.
Thanks, Rafter. So, yeah, as mentioned, one of the products we created was this report, which was basically a summary of some interviews that we hosted with several farmers in the 3 different regions of the Midwest, the Southeast, and the Northeast. So we interviewed about 16 BIPOC farmers, so they self-identified as BIPOC, and they had either been working on an agroforestry project or interested in an agroforestry project, but having some challenges getting it started. And we really wanted to understand the qualitative information about what's going on, like as a BIPOC farmer. So that Venn diagram that we just saw, what are the specific challenges that they're experiencing, and how can natural resource professionals support them, and specifically funders who are investing in this work? What can we do to make sure that there's intentional investment to support them in transitioning to agroforestry? And so we basically discussed all of the interviews and then created some recommendations in a few different categories of land, financing, access to information, shifting the culture of funding, and reclaiming traditions. So as we just saw in the Venn diagram, obviously land, financing, and access to information are things that, most farmers are facing, but then we have the compounded interests of like the histories of racial discrimination that have specifically been facing with these BIPOC farmers. And then we're not going to talk too much about shifting the culture of funding and reclaiming traditions in this presentation, because we want to keep it relevant to you all and what you all may be working on. So we will be talking a little bit about the financing and access to information piece of the report. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Rafter. So this is just an example of a quote that we got from one of the farmers in the Southeast, talking about their experience with technical service providers. So they're saying that I was really proactive. I wouldn't say they found me The programs I learned about were from conferences, and I really asked questions and followed up. It wasn't like they were sitting somewhere sending things out to BIPOC farmers. I've walked into FSA offices and asked about things I found online, funds for underserved farmers, and they told me funding for existing programs didn't exist. I also try to share info with other people, Black farmers and others underserved farmers. Otherwise, I don't think that they're getting it. So this quote really captures the dilemma that we're in of like still today, folks are having to really try to find out what information is available and really take care of each other. So BIPOC farmers, while some farmers have, a lot of access to information and understand how the system works and it really benefits them, the others are really just trying to get by and support each other as much as possible. Um, so we can go to the next slide. And then some of the recommendations that we came up with from listening to these farmers was obviously listening to them more. If you are someone who's supporting them with information, figuring out the best way to get them that information. So what are they actually needing? Excuse me. And what resources do you have available? And how, like, who are the people in their communities that are already in leadership roles? How can you build a relationship with them? And so we're obviously seeing that farmers learning from each other is a best practice in exchanging information. So figuring out ways to support that through field days and how they can really learn in person from people that they trust, really. Um, and then offering sustained support, beyond like, here's, some information. What does it look like to really be with them throughout the process? Was a big point of feedback that we got from them, making sure that they're able to not just start it up, but sustain those businesses. And we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, so, new farmers, first generation farmers, farmers on smaller plots of land, all face multiple challenges in accessing any kind of cost share programs, and other kinds of funding, even when they specifically target underserved farmers, as they often require upfront payment, of some or all the cost of adoption. And on top of that, BIPOC farmers continue to face racist treatment when they try and access USDA programs. So this quote from one of our interviewees: the underserved farmers grants give you 50% in advance to pay to get the work started. That leaves the other 50% to reimbursement. You have to get equipment and labor and all sorts of other things. Most first generation farmers don't have that kind of money out of pocket. A lot of times the people who are building your fences and other labor are not looking for 50%. They want to be paid right away. So some of the recommendations that came out of those discussions with those 16 farmers were to expand funding for direct support to BIPOC farmers and their networks for agroforestry adoption and community level capacity building, targeting resources for newer and undercapitalized farms, have unrestricted funding that can be applied across an agroforestry project to any project expense, and offer upfront funding for implementation and eliminate the matching requirements for newer, smaller, and undercapitalized farms, as well as streamlining and providing support through the application process, which all that paperwork is itself a major hurdle for farmers trying to access USDA programs in general.
Yeah, so shifting the culture again was something that we were discussing mainly in the context of funders in the agroforestry industry. But yeah, there's this pattern of investments being made, but institutions that are doing some of the funding and not necessarily the on the ground work being the ones that are actually able to sustain themselves. So this is one quote that we got from a farmer in the Midwest talking about some of the cultural shift that needs to happen in that dynamic. So I think the USDA should hand technical support over to community groups that have invested in relationships with the farmers. The lack of trust with USDA agencies, especially farmers of color, is a real concern, creating barriers that are hard to get over, especially with Black farmers excluded from farm programs for so many years, and now they want to help out. Now they want to help us out with our trees. Our old school farmers are like, forget it. We're not interested in any conversation with them now about trees. Until that relationship is repaired, we want to work with organizations that are more trusted, more successful in reaching people. So we'll talk a little bit more in the second half of this presentation about what that looks like to build a relationship, but just wanted to capture, this feedback that we're hearing about things need to shift dramatically about how this work is done.
One of the other major output of the first phase of Ruth and I working together on this project, there was this report up from the roots, and there was also a curriculum um, called the Fundamentals of Social Competency. And we are using this idea of social competency in agroforestry to kind of underline the idea that um, paying attention to and being informed and smart and thoughtful about legacies of discrimination and how they impact our work is not, that's not just like some special add-on. That's not some like additional activism that we're adding to the work that we're doing. That's just a sort of basic competency that's required that we in many cases need to build in order to be successful in the work that we're trying to do. Um, so we think of the work of growing a strong and dynamic agroforestry community as a three-legged stool. Um, and with two of the legs are ones that we're already, at least to some extent, talking about. So one, we've got technical competency, and this is certainly the leg of the stool that's receives the most attention, um, and the work of training and upskilling technical service providers and natural resource professionals is a serious sector, a serious aspect of the work that we're doing, the work that we're collectively doing, because farmers have talked a lot about how there aren't always trained service professionals in their area who can actually support them with agroforestry. And then we could add to that technical competency the area of cultural competency, which is um, which is something that has received a good deal of attention in the sort of natural resource advising and service provision world of just helping prepare people to work across difference and to work with people from different cultures and not either like have their foot in their mouth all the time or be surprised or put off that people with different backgrounds and experiences move through the world somewhat differently than you. And then we are adding to that the third leg of the stool, which we're calling social competency. Um, and we're looking at that as kind of community-centered perspective and an orientation towards service, not just trying to check boxes, not just trying to like clock in and clock out, but actually being interested in growing agroforestry in a way that is really dynamic and grounded in community. Part of social competency is cultural and historical awareness of the ways in which our own experiences and the experiences of other folks have shaped their relationship with the world and how they move in the world. A focus on working relationally and relationship building. This is not just about recruiting clients, but is about actually building human relationships with folks and holding a vision of long-term growth and diversification and change, and understanding that this is not a this is not a 1 year or 2 year or even a 5 year project. This is a long-term project of building the kind of deep and accessible agroforestry community that we need.
Yeah, so we broke down what we were researching and kind of put it into these different categories to understand, your context and then what it looks like to create programs around social competency. So starting with the personal, all of this is interconnected, but we each are individuals who obviously bring our own identities and experiences and just view of the world into the work that we're doing. So being aware of that and how it relates to other people, again, is, referencing that cultural competency piece of how we all come together and respect each other's differences, while also acknowledging the lens that we're bringing. And then the community context of what does this look like on a larger scale? So not just us as individuals, but groups of people and, the work that we're trying to do to not only strengthen the realities for each community, but especially those that have been underserved in the past. But what does it look like for us to be working together in community? And then our institutional context of obviously we have different organizations that we may be working with, and they have their own situations that, have a role in this kind of game that we're playing. And what does it look like to be aware of that in this work? And then we had a section on reaching out and making connections. So doing the actual movement work. So putting pieces together, networking and moving resources. And then developing a program that intentionally incorporates all of these aspects, to doing something that's new and different. So not just the same old, this is the work that we're doing, but what does it look like to actually have like operationalized equity in the programs that we're creating? So yeah, for understanding your personal context, this is a kind of wide, open-ended question, but just thinking about how does my personal history and cultural background affect my view of the world and interactions. So obviously we have very different ways of being raised and like what that looks like to, everything from what it means to be respectful. Some cultures have like looking at each other in the eyes or, not speaking to people of certain genders in certain ways. So thinking about the cultural background, your own personal history of, thinking about how have I been encouraged to take up space in different, scenarios. And obviously in an interaction where you're just talking about agroforestry, these things may not seem as relevant, but these little subtle, energetic ways of interacting with each other are influencing that dynamic, and an awareness of, what you're bringing to it and how much space you are able to take up is something to keep in mind, and how that could be different from other folks you're interacting with.
So understanding your community context, is the kind of you start to broaden your focus from um, understanding where you're coming from to understanding where am I operating here? Who's in the area? Um, who am I hoping that my work will be relevant to? Um, and if there's folks that I'm hoping to be relevant to that I don't know much about, or at least that I might think that I know about them, but if I don't have a history of relationship with these folks, particularly a history of positive relationship, then I might need to actually start with a little bit of research, to learn more about the communities that I'm interested in. And maybe even before that point, some research might be necessary to understand, okay, actually, who is in my area? As a natural resource professional, I may have a really good sense of who I'm currently working with and not necessarily have that great a sense of who's around, who's farming, who may not be actually, currently making use of our services. Um, and once I have a community in mind, the question becomes, what is the relationship of my institution within that community? What is our standing? Do we have existing relationships as individuals or collectively? Um, so where are we starting from in relationship to the communities on the ground doing the farming or interested in farming in our area? You want me to take this, Ruth?
Okay, sorry. It's transparent. I think we mixed up the slides a little bit, but yeah, so understanding your institutional context, again, thinking about who the organization that you're working within, what tools are available already? Is there funding available to support with the outreach and program development? Is there a little bit of wiggle room in the budget already? What is available already? So just asking that question. thinking about who within your organization you can consult with. If you have specific questions about how you can make your work a little bit more equitable. So if there isn't already programming that is intentional in the way that we're talking about, who do you need to be in conversation with either inside or outside of your organization to make it more possible? And what work can you be doing on the leadership end as far as influencing that? If it doesn't fit into your organization's strategic plan and mission, how can you collaborate with other organizations who do have that specific focus? What does it look like to build relationship and kind of be working together in that role if there are limits in your institution's capacity?
And once you've had that kind of stock taking of understanding where you're at, where the institution that you're working in is at, and where you're at in terms of a community on the ground, start reaching out from and making connections. And I think the most one of the most important shifts in perspective, and honestly, most difficult to implement in an institutional context, um, is shifting from a recruitment mindset to a relevance mindset. Um, I think it's really important that we figure out how to move away from uh, checking boxes and just fulfilling indicators and grant requirements. And it's really hard to do. It's understandable that folks want to be able to track how we're doing. And so a lot of times success looks like, oh, how many people from this community of interest actually came to this event? And it's not like that's not important. That's a meaningful piece of data, but our efforts tend to get in white dominated institutions, our efforts tend to get really organized around that as the important indicator rather than relationships built, which is a little bit harder to track and quantify. So shifting from a recruitment mindset to a relevance mindset and asking ourselves, what are the needs the specific community is experiencing? The best way to answer that question is by being in conversation over time with members of that community, figuring out how has this community interfaced with institutions in the past that have attempted to fill these gaps, institutions or grassroots groups, and how have those efforts gone? And I think a critical part of this this phase of the work is really showing up where people are and focusing less on trying to turn out people and to your events and invite people into your spaces, but actually showing up to community events, becoming a presence in the community, on their terms, right? And showing up to the things that they are already saying are important, whether that's community events or church events or wherever there are spaces that are open enough and will welcome you, going to the community rather than asking the community to come to you.
Yeah, and so to put this all into practice, thinking about the history of mistrust and current reality of mistrust, where folks are like, actually, I'm not going to work with you at all. Thinking about basic, tools like MOUs to really establish a relationship dynamic where accountability is present. So really outlining all of the mutual expectations and thinking about ahead of time what the needs are. So how can we, kind of meet in the middle of like what our expectations are as far as like communication standards? How often do we expect to hear from each other? Is there a gap in, communication? And what does the follow-up look like? Everything from those little details to what are the indicators of success as collectively defined? So Rafter just talked about, not just going into it with your goals, but really understanding what the community needs are, and the individual needs of the folks that you're in relationship with. So making sure that that's defined ahead of time. And then figuring out how to gather feedback about the relationship itself. How do you check in with each other? where is there opportunity to like in a safe space be able to share what's not working and how you can fix it if it's possible to fix it, and if it's not, is there like third party negotiators that are accessible to help to mediate any conflict that's taking place within communities or relationships that are trying to work together on this very sometimes challenging work. So thinking about how to get that all outlined and, on paper if possible and be accountable to that with feedback from the folks that you're working with ahead of time is a great tool to think about. So that's what we did so far. We produced a report. We did this social competency curriculum. That's kind of just a way to like center racial equity in agroforestry. Obviously, this is a much longer conversation. This, work will be continue to be done and expanded. So some of the things that we've identified that need to continue happening are building deep partnership with BIPOC organizations with aligned goals. So again, shifting away from this dynamic of there's a grant and then you're trying to build partnerships after you've already accepted a grant or written a grant. So thinking about what it looks like to be in co-authorship, collaborating on what the vision is and having that intentional goal setting ahead of time, developing in-depth and in-person trainings. So obviously we're talking about racial equity, which is like a whole, level of thinking about yourself and your place in the world and how to interact with each other. That tends to be more heart-centered than like a Zoom can hold. So thinking about ways to get together in person and really like support each other and think about what it means to be a human in this work is something that we would suggest either within organizations or between them. And then we think it's important to continue to develop these online materials as well. So this social competency module, for example, we've gotten feedback that there could be a lot more visual aids and ways to like have multimedia learning. So continuing to talk about it in ways that are accessible and really add more of the storytelling aspect to this work. And we really want to see more examples of this being successful. So we're talking about here are some baseline things that you should consider in this work, but we would love to see it in practice and have that documented as templates for others to use in their work. So what does it really look like? Here's what we've been successful in. And then continuing to understand from you all what the challenges are, from natural resource professionals who have been trying to work with BIPOC farmers and BIPOC farmers who've been trying to work with natural resource professionals. What are the actual challenges that, are coming up, and how can we kind of like work through those things together and, reach out to understand, yeah, again, like the successful case studies. So yeah, and we'd love to continue being in conversation with you all. And so now we're going to have a Q&A, I think.
Awesome. Thanks y'all for this share. I really appreciate that you put together like a roadmap, because I feel like there's a lot of people who are just like, okay, like I want to do this, but what do I do? And I feel like that's your presentation like just did that. It's like not specifics, but here's a template. Here's a process you can follow to get you from A to B, because sometimes A and B can feel so far away. So I think there's so much value in having something just really like concrete like that, just a set process. So thank you for sharing that. Um, so before we hop into our Q&A, and I see that we've got one attendee with a raised hand. We're going to get to the live Q&A in just a little bit. We've got 3 questions we're going to ask that are like our pre-prepared questions. But before that, we do these little quick fire rounds that are just basically like little icebreaker questions to like shake up the vibe and remember that we're all like silly, fun, wonderful human beings. So Ruth and Rafter, what was the last song that was stuck in your head?
Mm. I feel like it was a Beyonce song, honestly. Like
Nice.
the Beyonce and Miley Cyrus song, which if you haven't heard her country album, I would say high recommend. But
Awesome. Love it. Rafter?
My my housemate is in a chorus, and he shared this recording of him and his it's a quartet singing
Ooh.
Bobby McFerrin's arrangement of the 23rd Psalm.
Wow.
And
Obscure, love it.
that was stuck in my head for a while last night, so I just thought I'd
Oh,
put it out.
cool. That's really cool. Very niche. Okay, what's I feel like for some people there's just like an obvious answer to this, but what's the best popcorn topping?
Sriracha and nutritional yeast.
I knew
I
you'd
was
have something like that. That's very Heartwood of you.
I was gonna say the same. I agree because Rafter had me try some the last time I was there, and
Right?
it was I agree. It's objectively the best.
I have strong popcorn preferences that root from my time when I met you years and years and years ago, and they involve nutritional yeast.
Mm.
It really, it's yeah, it's critical. It's critical.
And because Ruth low-key mentioned this earlier, what's your favorite tropical fruit?
Soursop. It's guanabana, like it's in the custard.
Yeah.
Sweet, tangy, perfect.
Mm, mm.
It's got to be jackfruit for me.
Mm.
Sweet or savory?
Oh, sweet, sweet.
Yeah,
Yeah, ripe jackfruit. I don't, this
yeah.
whole craze for like like green unripe jackfruit. I don't know. I don't know about that.
Leave
But
it
a
to the
big
people.
ripe jackfruit, it's like the perfect party fruit. You need like six people to dismantle it. It's amazing.
Excellent. All right, so back to business. So I think there's this sort of like overarching question that you did talk about, but we wanted to make some space to talk about more. Is this, that like kind of obnoxious, like nasal voice going, but why? Like, why, why does this matter? Why are we having this conversation? Like, what is at stake? So I just want to like give a little space to that. Like, why have this conversation? Why reach across the aisle? Like, what might we lose? What might we gain? Um, yeah.
I mean, I think that like there's answers to that questions at like all different scales. And I think there's a really fundamental principle that um that having like a more diverse spaces is just a win. Creates like a more robust, dynamic, and interesting and resilient like space of whatever you're doing. Um, Having a more just society with like a more like a maybe a little bit more fair distribution of resources is a win for everybody, right? And so there's these kind of big picture reasons, and um, and then there's like just I think the threat that agroforestry uh can become something that is not actually that beneficial for the environment, or is that beneficial for communities, or is helping farmers that much. Because I think if it gets completely captured by, you know, large, uh, multinational conglomerates, if it gets captured by big ag, then that's probably what we'll see. I mean, that's just a really predictable result.
Hmm.
I mean, we see like the threat of that happening with regenerative ag in general. Um, and so I think the way that we keep from being detoured and captured in that way is by building like this deep, broad, accessible agroforestry space. And I don't really see another way to do it.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really just a return, like a part of the healing of the land is the land calling to its people, right? And so when we talk about agroforestry, we're not talking about anything new, like we're returning to a lot of traditional ecological knowledge. And so thinking about this land being stewarded by the folks that are indigenous to it is important, period. Like they need to have a say in how it's being used. Um, and in a lot of the interviews that we had where we were talking to the farmers about why they're interested in this work, like a lot of it is like this genetic calling of like, I need to return to the land. And so it's just the way that is required to heal both the people and the land. And not saying that, obviously people of any race that choose to be involved in farming are doing it because they love the land, right? But like, I think that that is an important way to Think about holistically, like reinvesting in the forest. So thinking about the forest is not just one kind of tree or one kind of organism. You got the mycelium network holding it all together, that rich soil, all of these diversity of nutrients are coming together and creating something that's more rich and more fruitful as a result of that. So yeah, as we've been talking about deep and wide and really building, a movement and as opposed to another trendy industry like climate smart agriculture is a return to like holistic forest, whatever, like how can we make a more sustainable movement, I think is the why.
Yeah, I love that. And, I think I'm kind of a fermentation nerd. And if anyone's familiar with Sandor Katz and his fermentation work and books, one of the big things that he does is just encourage people to go, like Sarah's like, yes, is to go talk, to your ancestors and talk to people in different cultures, especially elders, as much as possible, because, these stories of like Ida's Russian grandmother fermenting sauerkraut with rye straw in a barrel with weighted with, such and such a thing, and these methodologies, it's like, if no one asks those questions, then the story just disappears, and I feel like there is that, I feel like there's that's just a metaphor for the same process going on about lost, traditional ecological knowledge and
Mhm.
viewpoints and, across the space. Um, okay, so the next two questions we had that we talked about beforehand kind of really go together because it was sort of like, we're talking about why, how, and then the what. So the how being the like where to start. And I think y'all walked through that a bit, but I want to give some more space to that. And then just nod to the fact that our next question is about relationship building. So there may be some bleed over there. So yeah, where to start and then relationship building. If you want to cross over at any point, best practices, where to start, what to do, what not to do.
As far as where to start, like I think scoping out where you are currently, right? And where you want to be. So whatever existing relationships you have with the folks that you're trying to work with, again, we talked about like figuring out who you're already working with and who's in your area that you aren't currently working with, which could look like, looking at census data or, talking to people about figuring out where those people are that you don't already have a relationship with. And then as far as like bridging, like it takes a lot of time, right? Like it takes time to build relationship. And obviously like there's this mistrust and this tension with between racial dynamics and between institutions, but like regardless of your identity, it takes time, like myself as a black woman going into black communities that are new, I'm just like going to show up and just listen, like it's not your place to go in and be like, here's what you need to do, like here's what I'm observing. It's just listening, just like showing up and being available for whatever is asked of you. If anything is asked of you and being okay if nothing is, because the reality is that sometimes people don't want your help, people don't need your help. And it's okay for you to like just do your thing somewhere else, like figuring out where you are needed, I think is an important step.
Yeah. Thank you, Ruth. I didn't feel like you said most of it. The I think that just another like piece of that is just well, one, it's like we kind of like set that understand your context as a linear process, right? Of like personal and community and institutional. And you could actually start with any of those, but you got to do all three in order if you want to be effective. But like it could start from your sense of the community, it could start from what's happening in your institution. Um, and probably all three of those will be happening in parallel, And the other piece, and this definitely touches on the relationship building thing, is that like kind of like settle in, like in doing this sort of relational work, trying to like reweave like holes in the social fabric that were centuries in the making, you know? And so it's like it's like with that bit from the Talmud when the rabbi says, uh, "It is not for us to complete the work, but neither are we free to set it down." right? This is a project that is longer than any one job and is longer than any one of our lives. Um, and I think adopting that long view is really critical, because it is because if we're expecting to fix things this year or even in 3 years, like, or 5 years or whatever, then we're going to actually burn ourselves out, right? And it's a long haul. Um, and so we kind of just have to like forgive ourselves for being human, right? Um, and and just sort of like settle into to doing the work as we can with a long view. Um, yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say there.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a powerful piece. That gave me a little bit of chills. I like that. And in I think in agroforestry, maybe there's a unique opportunity for this because we're already working on really long timelines.
Yeah, yeah, correct.
Um, yeah, we've been in a number of conversations lately where, just talking about that concept and that reality. It's like we are in such a instant gratification reality and culture that it's like, waiting for a like text message to go through for 10 seconds. It's like, what is happening? You know? Um,
Yep.
and so there can be this uphill battle of getting people to think on like 80 or 100-year timelines, for like forest maturity or um, you know, 8 to 15 years for a tree crop to come in, is difficult already. So I wonder how y'all think that might, like, if there are opportunities there to, I don't know.
I would say again, like that is a very cultural, like that's a worldview, right? Thinking about future generations, like there are cultures that are like, anything that I do right now is for 7 generations ahead. I might not ever reap the benefit. I'm going to plant this tree and never eat its fruit because I want my, descendants to. And even not like just genetic, but thinking about your people as a whole as like being the benefits and like the full natural world is like a thing worth investing in. And so changing that worldview of like, I'm gonna reap, the profit or, the fruit of this thing that I'm investing into, like this is work again, like what Rafter just said is worth doing, period. Um, and I think the challenge with that is like we're seeing that the people that hold the power of like how decisions are made, um, are not necessarily aligned in that value. So like for example, we talk to farmers who are leasing land, right? Which like in agroforestry, that's difficult to like make those kinds of investments in general. But even if they do have like long-term lease, they have to like rely on the consent of the landowner before like planting certain trees or things like that. And there's like this threat of like shifting the way things are done. Because there's not as much proof, that it's worthwhile or whatever. So that's a matter of redistributing resources. Like, how can we get the land into the hands of the people who do have that vision, who do, value this long-term worth? And so, again, shifting the culture of how funding is done to like within 3 years, we want to see this product to this thing that we may never see the fruit of this investment that we're making is worth the investment. Like, that is the investment, you know?
Mm, yeah. Do you want to add anything, Rafter, before we keep moving?
Yeah. Yeah, just and also to like to say that they're also it's not like entirely about like a thankless investment in the future, right? There's actually, when you build relationships in this way, your world is getting bigger in the
Mhm.
span of your lifetime, right? And that is actually um that is a huge that's an incredible value, That's just like that's part of how we build a good life.
Yeah, like recognizing other yields in the process and in the system. Yeah. All right, we're about to switch to the open Q&A. So all those questions you've been thinking about, toss them in the Q&A. I have some in the Google Sheet from the open form that I can throw out to um, kind of pepper in there. But first, two more like quick round questions. If you were a garden, what would you be like? Would you be like a tidy English garden?
Hmm.
I
Definitely
feel
wouldn't
like
be a tidy English garden.
Yeah.
you
It's
would be.
I would not be, no.
No.
Really with that collar rafter? I'm just kidding. I think I would just put an urban garden, like a lot where we're like, let's fit as much as we can in here, tiny but mighty. We've got the perennials, we got the flowers, we got the vegetables, we just got anything you can imagine just being as useful as possible.
I'm picturing lots of like art installations too.
Yeah, there's
Yes.
murals.
Yes. Like color everywhere. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd be a forest garden, with uh like dwarf and semi-dwarf trees for the overstory and like lots of fruiting shrubs and perennials and mushrooms in the understory.
Mm.
Shafts of sunlight coming
Shafts of
through.
sunlight.
Yeah.
There'd have to be a section with full sun with a lot of squash growing because I really like making ephemeral clarinets out of squash stems. But subject for a different talk.
Like a whole webinar right there.
Right. I've been
Mushrooms,
trying to get
clarinet.
this instruction for a long time.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to, someone's been raising their hand for a long time. Let me see if I can, Suda, if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm gonna press allow to talk, which that verbiage cracks me up. You are allowed. Um, so I think now you can come on and ask your question, or you can type it in the chat. I will go ahead while we're waiting for that person to, oh, did we get you?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great session, though I joined in the middle, so I'm sorry for that. But right now, I'm very curious about the agroforestry and all, because I'm a grad student and I'm working on agroforestry related research, and I'm really curious about the impact of agroforestry that can have on the environment, the soil, and how can the farmers, the small scale farmers, are really not that much interested into the adoption of such practices. Like they are not that convinced like that can be beneficial for them. So how can we um have such approach or such efforts that can be done so that they get a kind of awareness, let's say, or they get a bit of active on the adoption of such practices so that this practice can be enhanced to some extent. Yeah, that's all I want to ask.
Thank you, Suda.
I can briefly answer, and then if Rafter or Emily, you guys want to jump on that. Just I think what's helpful for farmers to see that this is a worthwhile investment is seeing other farmers do it and be successful. So like those farmer to farmer networks that are like, hey, come look at my silvopasture crops, the cattle are really loving it, and I've been able to do such and such. So I think seeing the example. So obviously there's so many reports that are written about the benefits of agroforestry for the climate, but like making that shift, if you're already thinking about how do I sustain my farm operation, like most of the times, like adding on a whole other aspect of the work isn't something that folks are just dying to do. So figuring out that it is like a worthwhile transition, I think is one of the best ways to support farmers with doing it. And if it's not, that's also okay.
You said it, Ruth. I mean, first of all, figuring out if there's any kind of local champions, right? Folks who are interested and supporting them as much as possible to demonstrate systems and to help other, like maybe organizing farmer field days so that folks can come and witness what's working and understand the benefits from another farmer.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. And if anyone else has questions that wants to raise hand, go ahead. Let's see, we've got one in the Q&A function. Says from Kelda, says, great work. What kind of barriers does Project 2025 pose to spreading your work to service providers? Are terms or concepts here going to be disallowed at USDA, like the term climate change? And yeah, I'll let y'all take that. And with the caveat that none of us have a crystal ball. And yeah, I something I've actually that I forgot to say before this Q&A that I usually try to preface with is like there's a lot of questions that with a lot of specificity or like people sometimes will come with like a super specific question that we don't actually even have time to unpack in these. So there's always freedom to give short or like incomplete answers if you feel like you can't like go deep somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could have been added on that last slide at the end of continuing the work. Like, what does this look like in this specific political context where like a lot of what we've been invested in is currently under threat? We've not done the research already. That's not in the report or the curriculum. But I think it's going to take a lot of conversations and figuring out what does it look like? How can we create, some resilience in this context?
I mean, it's in some ways, I feel like it's a really fair question and a good question. It also right now feels like, well, what's life going to be like after the car wreck? Like, I really don't know just how bad it's going to be or how insane it's going to be. It's definitely going to be insane. Um, so, um, I mean, I think, a lot of this work depends on um, work outside of the work outside of government institutions. A lot of this is community work. A lot of this is housed in nonprofits and not in like NRCS offices. And there's obviously going to be fast and cascading impacts from whatever changes are coming down the pike. But I think it's really worth, with agroforestry, as with other kinds of cascading changes that we're looking at coming up, I think it's really worthwhile to turn towards examples and experiences from other parts of the world, um, where folks have dealt with the rise of authoritarian governments over and over again. Like, look to our brothers and sisters in the third world, who have done all kinds of organizing, including growing agroforestry, um, uh, without the support of and sometimes in defiance of their governments. Um, and I think that's an important perspective and an important set of like histories and relationships that we should be tapping into as we try and navigate the next few years.
That's the end of the Q&A pool with what people have submitted live, but I have some background questions from the online form. So actually, maybe I'll paste these into the chat too, in case it's easier to be able to like see what you're answering. But one was, what about land access and leasing? Is there a difference in willingness or perception when working on a longer timeline like tree systems?
I'm not sure that I understand the question.
I think that's the problem with not having the live questioner. I think in terms of knowing that, that leasing is often an equitable entry point, have y'all heard of or observed like a difference in someone willing to lease to folks who are working in these like long-term perennial systems versus putting annuals or something less permanent onto the landscape? I think that is the interpretation.
Yeah. Um, if I as far as I can recall, that's sort of outside of what we've looked into in our research. It's certainly important. I mean, land access and different forms of land access have a huge impact on the ability of folks to implement these long-term systems. Um, I'm not sure if there's research that's like really addressing that pinpoint, but like there's a fair amount of research showing that having having short-term to even medium-term leases definitely inhibits the ability of farmers to implement regenerative practices, even with annual systems. And we know that that makes it, that much less likely that they can implement really long-lived perennial systems. But I feel like I'm not sure how prevalent it is, but we've definitely seen the rising levels of interest in really long-term leases and like 99-year leases. But I'm not sure how widespread that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't really talk to many landowners. It was like folks that are farming and interested in getting access to land primarily, but and so this isn't informed necessarily by my research, but I think that there's this other aspect of like beyond having access to the land, which is, can be a contractual thing. I think what we're trying to get at is like there's also conflict and tension that can come up between the landowner and like the farmer if there even if there is a long-term lease. So thinking about ways to work through that is a challenge that I've been hearing, is pretty persistent, even if there is ownership of the land, like what does it look like to work through that conflict and like make it more habitable. So like getting aligned on values is like a whole separate aspect of work. So the lease is just one part of it is all I wanted to point out.
And I think that in your presentation, y'all talked about just like an MOU. And I think that that's such I mean, it's kind of, it almost sounds like this obvious low-hanging fruit piece, but to like come together enough to like create and like to actually create an MOU with somebody and really think through all those scenarios, I feel like that in itself is such a powerful piece of or navigating these situations because it like seems it's like a very like approachable, appropriate way to like start a conversation, under the guise of an MOU that is really like a very, if you're going to agree to work on somebody's land for a long time, that's a big conversation, but like I feel like that's a good inroads.
Mhm.
Okay, so I just
I just
copied
want to
in.
clarify
Oh yeah,
one point
please.
that Ruth made, which was that we actually did talk to a few landowners, but we didn't talk to any landlords. We didn't talk to any landowners who were renting their land out to
Yeah,
farmers.
sorry. Thanks for clarifying that.
So I just copied in another question from the Google form. What are some ways to ensure that our perennial systems uplift the cultural practices and knowledges of Indigenous and BIPOC communities? Are there any particular resources or knowledge traditions we can lean on?
Yeah, I think building relationship with like the local indigenous folks is probably the best way to uplift their work and like figuring out what ways they would want to be honored, like and including, maybe that means access to your land and access to like being able to teach their own practices on your land. I think it really just depends on what they want. So we can't really offer like a universal recommendation. But yeah, I think being in conversation, um, and honoring them, even, if they aren't there, like naming them. So thinking about what movements they have. And Rafter, I'll let you add on to that.
That's mostly, the just learning about the cultures and the communities indigenous to your area, whether they're still in the area or not. Learning about traditional foodways. There's no one resource for the whole country. It's really quite particular. I mean, there's more and more like great books and resources out there. Uh, People have probably heard of Tending the Wild and Braiding Sweetgrass. Like there are ways to start learning as preparation for or in parallel to like relationship building and reaching out and having conversations with folks. Um, and yeah, just learning directly and indirectly.
Yeah, like just an example, like I know locally here there is a farm that has a an agroforestry project where they're actually trying to do like a public food forest kind of situation. And they reached out to the local like Piscataway tribe and have been in conversation with